We heard Senator Casey describing legislation that he's co-sponsoring to thwart the problem of sexual assault on board our airplanes. We'll invite our panel to come up. And we're very encouraged by his leadership in that regard. In today's first panel, we'll build on his remarks about airline passenger behavior. As I mentioned, our first panel ties in very well with Senator Casey's efforts to stop sexual assault on aircraft, and it's on the more general subject of disruptive airline passengers. And First Officer Matt Clark serves as Delta's MEC Security Chair, and he's going to introduce this panel and get us started. Thank you, Matt. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first panel discussion on day 2 of the 64th Annual ALPA Air Safety Forum. My name is Matt Clark, and I'm a pilot with Delta Airlines. I'm also the Delta MEC Security Chairman, and I'll be moderating this panel. The name of today's panel, as you've probably noticed, is the Disruptive Passenger, Keeping Problems Off the Airplane. Now, when it comes to most airline industry metrics, like on-time performance, lost bags, and other safety-related areas, I think most of us can agree that the data is consistently and successfully reported, tracked, and analyzed by all industry stakeholders. Unfortunately, data on unruly passenger events does not enjoy the same comprehensive level of attention that perhaps it should. In fact, there's a startling disconnect between the number of disruptive passenger incidents reported and the number of events that actually occur. Only through the phenomena of smartphone video cameras and social media has the frequency and types of incidents come to light in the public's eye. To illustrate this point, let us contrast the two most prominent resources for data on incidents, which would be from industry group IATA and the FAA. For example, in 2016, there were exactly 100 unruly passenger events reported to the FAA. That same year, industry group IATA put the number at 9,837. 100 incidents compared with almost 10,000. That's a remarkably huge difference. It's also important to note that of those almost 10,000 incidents, intoxication from alcohol and/or drugs was cited as a contributing factor in over 33% of incidents. Some of the IATA data is presented on the screen to my right and left. The discrepancy between sources speaks volumes to the lack of reporting and the standardization of data collection. In this modern era of big data analytics, not having readily observable, reliable data to describe what is actually taking place on today's airliners only adds to the complexity of solving this problem. It's important to note that unlike safety events, like engine failures, serious passenger injuries, aircraft damage, etc., there is no requirement for unruly passenger events to be reported by the industry, thus making it difficult to know the actual number of events. Thus, the cataloging and tracking of such events is cumbersome and often incomplete. Despite the current efforts of some industry stakeholders, we continue to see an overall increase in the annual number of incidents with ever-growing implications for airlines, passengers, and crews. Please remember that while the statistics provided here represent the best picture of unruly passenger events, they do not include all airlines around the world, so they likely underestimate the true extent of the problem. To further illustrate the significance of this issue, we have another slide that lists some of the headlines from a few of the events occurring in the last 6 months. While unruly passengers might account for a small percentage of the traveling public, they can have a disproportionate impact on everyone else. Delays, missed connections, and diversions are just a few of the complications that can result from unruly passengers. These can have a snowball-like effect on everyone involved that translates into lost productivity, missed meetings or vacations, and potentially significant costs, real financial costs for all parties. These costs often run in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single diverted flight. For example, IATA estimates the cost of a single flight diversion at about $200,000. Responding to an unruly passenger event can be a monumental task when you consider the fact that the incident is taking place about 7 miles above the surface of the Earth in a pressurized metal tube traveling at about 500 miles per hour. Unlike when this sort of incident occurs in any other more common public setting, simply walking away, calling 911, or pulling over to the side of the road is not an option. In fact, oftentimes huge volumes of resources may be required to respond to an unruly passenger once the flight has departed. Rerouting by air traffic controllers, loss of airspace or taxiways for nearby aircraft, additional airline support staff, law enforcement personnel, additional fuel, hotels and passenger accommodations, medical bills, lawsuits, and a variety of other resources may all be needed in response to just one unruly passenger. True, the potential losses in time, productivity, and the associated financial costs are substantial. However, there's far more at stake here. As was noted by the Congressman, sexual assaults targeting both passengers and flight attendants occur all too often. We have also seen a number of incidents become physically violent. When this happens, crew and passengers alike may feel as though they are literally fighting for their lives aboard a given flight. Our industry simply cannot afford to become tone deaf to these types of incidents when the public safety is at stake. While it's not a concept that we want to embrace, the simple fact that a single passenger has the ability to jeopardize the safety of an entire flight must be acknowledged. Some industry stakeholders have endeavored to make changes to curb the proliferation of these events, but we believe that more can be done to develop a comprehensive plan involving all relevant parties. And all of this leads us to where we are today. With so much left to be done to truly begin addressing and preventing these types of incidents, we have brought together a panel of industry experts to get their perspective on what they view as the underlying problem and contributing factors here in the U.S., as well as what we can do as an industry to try and curb the problem. With much gratitude, I welcome their insight, their experience, and participation in today's discussion. We've arranged the order of our speakers today in the same manner that we approach aviation security as a whole, from the curb at the front of the terminal, all the way through the airport and into the aircraft cabin. Starting with the panelists sitting closest to me and moving to your right, allow me to introduce them to you. Our first panelist, who will provide the airport's perspective on this issue, is Christopher Bidwell. Chris is the Vice President for Security for Airport Councils International, North America. Our next panelist, representing law enforcement's role, will be Chief Michael Everson. Chief Everson is the Chief of Police for the Metropolitan Airports Commission at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport and the President of Airport Law Enforcement Agency Network. Our third panelist, providing the airline's point of view, is Alexandra Orr. Alexy is the Manager of Global Security and Compliance for United Airlines. Our next panelist, representing the group most directly affected by this issue, our flight attendants, is Sara Nelson. Sara is the International President for the Association of Flight Attendants. And our final panelist, who will provide the FAA's view on this, is Stephen Moates, who is the Manager of FAA's Part 121 Air Carrier Operations. Panelists, thank you very much for being here today. I would like to remind our audience, this is an informal panel discussion, and we highly encourage your participation. At this point, I'll turn the microphone over to our panelists. I ask that each of you introduce yourselves briefly and offer any opening thoughts on the issue. We will then open the floor to questions. Chris, welcome again, sir. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thanks very much. I'd like to thank Matt, Randy, Jerry, and the ALPA team for the opportunity to participate on this distinguished panel this morning. As Matt said, my name is Chris Bidwell. I'm Vice President of Security for Airports Council International North America. We represent airports in the U.S. and Canada. In preparation for this panel, I did a little research, and one of the interesting things that I found that I think is pertinent is that in 2006, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration funded research on state statutes and regulations pertaining to alcohol sales and/or service to intoxicated people. Although primarily focused on reducing injuries and fatalities resulting from impaired driving, the research is, as I said, pertinent. The research was intended to examine the variation in state laws on sales to intoxicated persons, how statutory language was interpreted in court cases, and key issues associated with the enforcement and adjudication practices. The report was issued in 2009, and it revealed a number of interesting findings. Almost every state, except for Florida and Nevada, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, I guess, prohibits sales of alcohol to intoxicated persons. However, states use different terminology to denote that providing alcohol to intoxicated persons is prohibited, and for the visible and observable signs of intoxications. States have two penalties at their disposal. One is criminal, and the other is administrative in nature or civil, but they do not specify what the actual penalties are. The enforcement laws relating to sales to intoxicated people is relatively rare, and this is due to, one, cultural norms regarding acceptability of sales to intoxicated people, and the lack of political will to enforce it. Also, limited resources to support enforcement, and statutory provisions related to the element of proof that makes evidence collection overly burdensome. 2 states, Washington and Utah, collect information about place of last drink and target investigations of establishments identified as problem locations. And that might be something that we can leverage as a means to address these challenges. So it's interesting to note also that with the expansion of mobile check-in, the number of touch points, if you will, where a traveler interacts with an airline or TSA representative has been significantly reduced. And in most cases, they don't come into contact with airport representatives or airport law enforcement unless the airline calls upon them to respond. So the regulatory relationship is really between the state and the establishment that sells alcohol. Therefore, it's incumbent upon the establishment, which could include a bar, restaurant, or airline club at an airport, to enforce the prohibition on sales to intoxicated individuals. So let's talk about law enforcement for just a minute, and I know Mike's gonna go into this as well, but in accordance with TSA regulations, airport operators are responsible and required to provide law enforcement personnel in the number and manner adequate to support their airport security program. Airport law enforcement have numerous responsibilities, to include responding to calls from airport operators or foreign air carriers, deterrence and prevention of criminal activity, investigating crimes, traffic enforcement, participating in vulnerability assessments, intelligence information gathering and sharing, and also supporting TSA passenger screening operations. And I want to touch on that for just a minute, because this is something, or an area rather, that has impacted the availability of law enforcement. So after 9/11, Congress enacted the Aviation and Transportation Security Act. This legislation not only created TSA, but it also directed the deployment of law enforcement personnel authorized to carry firearms at each airport security screening location to ensure safety and national security. Initially, TSA had planned to deploy federal law enforcement to each checkpoint. However, they never received funding to do so, so they've only got a limited cadre of federal law enforcement officers. Therefore, TSA established the Law Enforcement Officer Reimbursement Program to provide partial reimbursement to airport operators for providing airport law enforcement to support TSA screening operations. Recently, however, the number of requirements placed on airport law enforcement have increased significantly, but the amount airports are reimbursed for the provision of airport law enforcement have decreased. And the administration has proposed to eliminate this key program. With the recent attacks in public areas of airports, it's simply inconceivable that Congress would cut funding for the TSA Law Enforcement Officer Reimbursement Program. And it's something that we certainly oppose the elimination of and think it should be funded appropriately, because airport law enforcement plays a critical role in supporting civil aviation security. So just a few considerations. A community-based approach is necessary to minimize the number of disruptive passengers. Identifying problem states, practices, and establishments would provide a good method for deterring these sorts of acts. And as Matt said at the outset, you can't underscore the importance of reporting as much information as is available. Thanks very much.
Chief Everson, please.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Like Matt said, my name is Mike Everson. I'm the Chief of Police at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. I'm also the current president of the Airport Law Enforcement Agencies Network. Airline, as it's referred to, is an organization that airport law enforcement agencies belong to. It's not an individual membership. We have about 120 member airports, and then each one of those member airports also have numerous of their officers and command staff that are participating in it as well. So I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to be here. I do think it's truly an honor to present with this panel today, and I want to thank all of you for keeping us safe in the skies, and we appreciate what you do as far as a law enforcement perspective. We truly do. I want to take a minute just to talk a little bit about the history, and my comments today are going to be about the law enforcement response to these disruptive passengers. We're not there in the sky when it happens. Sometimes the plane never gets off the ground, but we're there when the door opens, when you guys call for help. So I want to talk a little bit about the history as far as how we got here. Obviously, this isn't a new phenomenon, but as Matt had indicated in his slide, and I'll certainly, I didn't know those stats, and I think those stats are kind of staggering as far as the amount. But like I said, it's not a new phenomenon. We did enjoy a short period, as you all probably remember, both on the ground and in the air, for a time period after 9/11 where these types of instances diminished significantly. And I think that's because we had everybody's attention, and I think people were a little bit more apprehensive about doing things that got those situations out of hand. We've come full circle, and everybody has forgotten, both on the ground and in the air. And we are now in a situation, as far as I'm concerned, where it's far worse than it ever has been before, and I think Matt's stats show a lot to give credit to that. So let's talk a little bit about the types. So we talked about alcohol. So clearly alcohol, I think it was like 30-some% of the instances it's involved in. There's also illicit drugs. There's prescription drugs. There is the combination of all three together, which is the worst case scenario. And then there's the scenario where none of those are present and you have somebody who's in crisis. Those are also very difficult and challenging situations, and no less difficult to try to solve, especially in the air, without the proper resources to deal with that, because it is a medical situation. And then sometimes you have that crisis individual who has combined alcohol with the medications that they were supposed to be on, and that is truly a very, very dangerous situation as well. So none of that has changed. So that's that history that I was talking about. None of that has changed except for the fact that it is getting worse. So what law enforcement will do when we're called, and a lot of times that first call comes to us by way of the tower, from the flight deck communicating with the tower, so we know what we have. Sometimes those are diversions, sometimes those are planes that were coming to our airports initially, and we're going to find out what happened. We're going to want to talk to the flight crew, and we're going to want to talk to the flight deck and find out what exactly had happened, and that will gauge how we deal with the situation accordingly. So sometimes those situations are dangerous and they're dynamic, and we don't have a choice, and we have to go in and we have to deal with the situation right then and now. So we don't like to do that, but we have to. So what has changed? What has changed, when we talked a little bit about the prevalence of the phones and social media and live streaming different things, airports, law enforcement agencies, and airlines all have a vested interest in dealing with that person outside of the public eye. So first of all, those situations they're not pretty. Removing somebody forcefully from an aircraft for good reason is not a pretty sight. And I think you've all experienced that. And we've all seen it on the internet, and it's not pretty. So we don't want to do that in the, we don't want to do that in the worldwide eye. Prior to the prevalence of that, we would go onto the aircraft, and depending upon what the situation was, we would try to encourage the person to come off the aircraft peacefully. If that did not work, then we would ask somebody, a responsible party from the airline, whether it's management on the ground or somebody from the flight deck, to tell that person that they're no longer welcome and that they have to leave. If they refuse to do that, we would remove people from the direct area around that passenger for their own safety, and we would take them off. and there was more times than not, they needed to get off, they deserved to get off, and I'll be honest, it was a little bit fun when you would be pulling somebody off the aircraft and you get that round of applause. So it was fun. I miss those days. I'm just being honest. So nowadays, we've taken a little bit different approach. Many airport law enforcement agencies have gone back and we've adapted our policies and how we deal with these disruptive passengers to account for that. Minimize the exposure to the airline, minimize the exposure to the department and to the airport, and to minimize the injury that we have to other passengers. And the way we do that is those first two steps that I talked about, trying to get them to come off, asking somebody from the airline to tell them they're no longer welcome. Then we ask everybody, where we tell the flight deck or somebody from the airline, in order for us to remove this passenger, you're going to have to deplane that aircraft. And as Matt was saying, that's an expensive proposition, but many of us, including in my city, we will not forcibly remove somebody who's being passively resistant and without the aircraft being deplaned. We just won't do it anymore. Many other agencies are now doing that as well. And it's not just because we don't want everybody to see this on the internet. It is dangerous, and like I said, it's not pretty, and but it's the way it needs to be done. So that does create a bit of a controversy sometimes, especially, I mean, you know, we talked about the dollars associated with those diversions and deplaning and how long that takes, and so you know what you're getting in for. So I guess I would urge the representatives here today from the various airlines that if you get that request from law enforcement, please heed that, because we need your assistance in doing that. If in fact they will not deplane the plane, and we won't, you know, in most cases we won't go in there. We won't go in and do it. We're going to encourage you to continue to try to get coax the person to come off, but we're not going to do that unless the situation changes. If the situation becomes assault, if it becomes an emergency situation where we don't have a choice, we have to go in for the safety of others, we will, but in most cases they won't. Now the good news is what we found out since we started doing that once the plane starts deplaning, the person comes off. Because there's really no reason for them to stay on the plane anymore because the plane's not going anywhere. So just the nature of doing that usually gets that person to be more compliant in the first place, but not always. So we talked about what can be done. And the bad news is that you have people that are coming in and they're drinking, and I'm specifically talking about the alcohol related. They're drinking in the establishments, which all of the airports very much want, because they want that revenue. Then they're going on to your aircraft, and they're continuing to probably drink. And then maybe they're having a layover, and then they're going to go back to the airport, and they're going to start drinking again, only to get on another plane or two, and the progression of that drinking just continues. So that is challenging. Now, when they're sitting in your aircraft, it's much more difficult to try to determine that level of intoxication when they're simply just sitting there. And you may have a brief, the flight attendants may have a brief conversation about what I want to drink, but it is really, really difficult when somebody is sitting in a chair, not really verbalizing too much. It's really difficult to tell. So it becomes challenging for the flight attendant to try to determine somebody's level of intoxication so that they can gauge whether or not they're going to be able to provide responsible alcohol service. And that is challenging, and I'm not sure if we're going to talk about that here a little bit today. But there are things that can be done. Airports like mine, we have proactively for years been teaching responsible service to the food and beverage venues in our airports. And some of the better food and beverage vendors mandate that for their wait staff. So, and that is very helpful. And not only is it responsible service, but also recognizing and identifying underage potential service as well. Another thing that local law enforcement all around the country, whether it's at an airport or not, that we have done is we've been engaging in what we call CIT training, so it's crisis intervention training, and that's the tactics that we use to try to deal with somebody and first of all identify whether or not they're in a crisis situation or not, and then how to properly deal with them. And that also goes in hand with de-escalation. So there's de-escalation training that shows us the different types of techniques, and it all kind of plays into one big package of trying to provide better law enforcement services to get people the help that they need. And in some cases, it's hospitalization. In some cases, it may be detention. So one of the things as far as best practices that I like to talk about here is that same level of training cooperatively that the airlines will do, and I know that there's lots of training that happens. De-escalation training is very important. Crisis intervention training is also very important, as well as responsible service of alcohol. So, and that's not just in the aircraft. It's also at the gates. We see people in the gates all the time. And I was just having a conversation with somebody a couple of days ago, how they were at DCA, they were sitting there at a restaurant, and they were in a delay, and they sat and they watched somebody just drink after drink after drink after drink, and it never occurred to the food and beverage server that, hey, maybe this person's had enough after about 8. And then that person continued to get on that aircraft. Now that person told me that they had gone to the gate agent and they said, hey, that guy over there has probably had a little bit too much. And that gate agent said, okay, well, we'll keep an eye on him. And person got on the aircraft. Now, I don't know if anything happened or not. I'll assume that it didn't. But that's a bad situation. That situation is setting itself up to end badly. And so I think that awareness and that cooperation with the airports, the law enforcement agencies, the airlines, not only in the air but on the ground, to help identify these things so we don't put ourselves in the situation where we have to deal with that. Now, there's sometimes you just can't help, okay? You just can't fix all the different problems, and somebody is going to get themselves into that situation, and even if every step along the way, steps were taken to try to mitigate that, it happens anyway. And in those cases, your training and your ability to deal with those individuals in the air until you can get them on the ground and we can intervene, sometimes that's what we have to do. So that's the end of my comments today. I'm be willing to engage in other conversations if people have questions. So.
Thank you, Chief. Mm-hmm. And Alexy, please.
Firstly, Matt, I'd like to thank you for not citing United Airlines on the recent incidents slide. We appreciate that. Sorry. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Alexy. I am a manager in corporate security at United Airlines. And for the past 4 years, I've had direct oversight over our formalized programs created to address disruptive passengers and unruly behavior. Actually, 11 years ago, in 2007, United Corporate Security, our legal division, AFA, ALPA, joined together and discussed how can we support our employees when they are the victims of assault on board an aircraft or in the airport. Ultimately, it was decided that one person should not be solely responsible for determining what, if any, action is taken against the customer, and that a complete incident investigation should be completed for each and every allegation of assault. So with what we call the Passenger Incident Review Committee, or PIRC, another acronym, we established a cross-functional group comprised of director levels or above from legal, corporate security, the affected employees division, so whether that's the pilot group, the flight attendant, or customer service group. We decided that we needed to have an in-person meeting where we all gathered to hear the details of the investigation and discuss and unanimously agree upon a decision for that customer and in support of our employee. Additionally, the formalized process provides post-incident legal and emotional support to our employees. So soon after establishing that process, we realized we needed a parallel program for those instances of passengers assaulting other passengers. Whether it's a fight over an armrest or an intoxicated wrestling match on board, we've seen it all, and every incident is investigated fully. So for perspective, from 2007 to 2012, the first 5 years of our program, we averaged about 40 to 50 cases per year. In 2017, we had 335 total cases, and we're projected to at least double that number this year. So there's no sign that these numbers will stop growing anytime soon, as Matt alluded to. Again, we analyze each case to determine the appropriate response. based upon, among many things, the severity of the assault, the passenger's post-incident conduct and position, the passenger's prior history with United, or any other factors relevant to determining the degree to which they present a safety risk. Our policy is to delay travel or refuse to carry any passenger whose conduct or condition, again, threatens the safety or security of our flight. In 2015, the committee created yet another subgroup to address that customer group that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of physical assault, but rather they cause some kind of operational impact, whether it's a diversion, a return to gate, a damage to the aircraft in some way. We actually investigate each of those incidents as well, and then we seek restitution costs and take appropriate measures with those customers as well. So what started as an ad hoc meeting every time one of these unfortunate events happened has now become a weekly meeting. It's fully visible by senior leadership, attended by our leadership, and we track all passenger travel for those that are inducted into the program. So that's a daily monitoring of passenger travel. The growth in passenger incidents has required program-specific training for our frontline employees, and how to report these incidents has become critical because communication is at the essence of our incident investigation. Obviously, the use of small cameras and mobile devices for photography is permitted on board, and our airplanes are considered public space, which makes it difficult to monitor. If a customer refuses to stop taking pictures or video, and our crew strongly believes that there's malicious intent or suspicious irrational behavior occurring, our policy is for crew to follow their normal escalation procedures, which, again, key focus on communication, and that eventually leads to a passenger incident review and a full committee rendering. So that's a high-level overview of our passenger programs. In discussions with our flying partners, both domestically and internationally, we've realized that we have quite a robust system that's been around for a fair amount of time, over 10 years, and we're pretty proud of that. And again, I'm happy to be here and answer any questions you might have about that.
Thank you.
So, Matt, thank you for bringing the panel together. When President Knoll called me to ask me if I would be willing to take part in this panel, I said, oh, my favorite topic. And he said, well, one that you know well anyway, and this is true. My name is Sara Nelson. I'm the president of the Association of Flight Attendants. We represent 50,000 flight attendants at 20 different airlines. And some of them are here with us today, I'm proud to say. But, you know, this is an issue that we face every single day on the job. And those incidents that are reported by IATA, that is not even the true toll of how many times we face these issues on a daily basis, because flight attendants have become experts, and they spend the majority of their time practicing de-escalation skills so that these conflicts between passengers that arise do not rise to the level of interfering with the entire flight. So I'm happy to talk about this. I want to be as brief as possible so that we can get to your discussion, because safety and security doesn't just happen. It happens because the people in this room demand that it happens. It happens because you're engaged. It happens because we have unions that promote these kinds of discussions with ourselves, with our airlines, with the federal agencies. And I cannot thank you enough for your focus on that and your efforts to bring real attention to this issue. So, first and foremost, Senator Casey talked about the fighting and the division in the country, and creating an atmosphere at the airport and on our planes where there is respect and civility is critical. That's why this year it's so important that we're speaking out and making it very clear that sexual harassment and sexual assault has no place on our planes. This is critical as part of our efforts to create an atmosphere on the plane where we are going to understand that everyone is going to have respect for each other. When he was talking about passenger-on-passenger sexual assault and flight attendants responding to that, remember that these are the flight attendants who were originally held up as sex objects to sell tickets, and that was never denounced by the industry. I want to commend United Airlines, Alaska Airlines, and Spirit Airlines for stepping up immediately, their CEOs putting out very clear statements that this is a new day. And we're not going to tolerate that at our airlines. I want to thank all of you for participating in that message to the traveling public and to flight crews so that we can have the authority and respect to be able to de-escalate in the cabin, to be able to manage the issues that we're facing. So that first and foremost, creating that atmosphere is so critically important. I also want to note that there is an issue here systemically in the country, this issue of inequality. These issues are real. People get on our planes, they walk through first class, they walk through some sort of comfort level of economy, then they walk to their seat that is getting smaller and closer together. And people are feeling the squeeze. They're feeling the squeeze in their hometowns, they're feeling the squeeze in their paychecks, and we have more and more people on our planes today because ticket prices are down to the lowest levels that they've been since deregulation, 40% below what they were at deregulation if you account for inflation. More people are traveling than ever before, but they don't have the money to survive in their hometowns. They're working 2 and 3 jobs, and they're feeling this inequity. This is exacerbated by the 1982 allowing shareholder buybacks to inflate the price of the stock and not reinvest into the airline, not determine whether or not the company is succeeding based on its operational performance, based on the performance of the employees and what we're turning out, and how the executives are running the airline. And this is problematic. You see it in the complaints about a pilot shortage that we know is really a pay shortage, right? So these are issues that are real because what has happened since then, we talked about how there was a level of respect and civility in this idea that we're in this together after 9/11. There was also still the staffing levels at the gate and on the planes that were in place prior to 9/11. Typically, on any domestic flight, flight attendant staffing was 25 to 50% greater than it is today. It's at FAA minimums. Same with at the gate. The customer service agents now are down to minimum staffing levels. When that happens, when you have one agent at the gate, you have minimum staffing levels on the plane. And sometimes we're boarding the plane prior to the pilots even making it to the plane, right? So we don't have that communication vehicle through the cockpit. We cannot talk with each other about what's going on. It's difficult for an agent to say, hey, we got a tip that maybe somebody's intoxicated, we need to watch them. I would hope that that person is kept completely off the plane in the first place. Best way to avoid a problem in flight is to keep them off the plane. But we don't have the ability to communicate on issues with each other, and that creates huge problems with carry-on bags, which are a huge reason that people are fighting with each other on board the flight, trying to find their area of space and their ability to get that carry-on bag on board. We don't have the ability to communicate on an issue of maybe a family isn't seated together and we can get a heads up and we can start trying to work on issues like that. So we have huge problems with minimum staffing today that exacerbates the issues that we're facing on board with our aircraft fuller than ever, seats closer together than ever, and more people sitting in those seats. With this idea that we are a divided country, and that is real. The political discussion in this country is real on our planes, and we're often at the tip of the spear as flight attendants in dealing with that. Because when you bring humanity together, anytime you bring humanity that close together, there's bound to be conflict from time to time. But if you also come with this idea that we are divided, that we don't respect each other, that we're not in this together, that just raises the temperature and the divide and the feeling of inequity and creates a higher likelihood of that conflict. Layer on top of that the failure to communicate throughout the airport, at the gate, and then on the plane about someone's alcohol intake or any other behavior that we may have been witnessing, and we're at a complete disadvantage now on the plane. And we're not doing what we need to do to keep those issues off the plane and on the other side of the door before we take off and have big problems in the air. In terms of photography, Alexy, I'm glad you touched on this. This is, of course, a huge issue. Everyone's got their phones now. It is unrealistic to say that people are not going to bring those phones out and be taking pictures of themselves and their families. And so, while United, I think, has had a very difficult job of communicating around this issue, but being very realistic with crews that these phones are going to be in people's hands. There are not laws on the books to tell people that you have to completely put those away. Crew members also like to have good catalogs of our great service that we give to people and all the good things that we do. But if there is an interference with crew member duties or a suspicion of safety or security issues, then we need to work together and we need backing from the flight deck to help people understand they've got to put that phone away. I want to take people back to why these policies, in some cases, were in place in the first place. The other passengers on the plane have not given someone else the permission to take their image and use that. We've had flight attendants who have been stalked at home. And so we have to recognize that not everyone who is taking that camera out to document their fun trip is doing it because it's just fun. We have to really be watching these issues, and it puts crew members in an incredibly difficult position to be able to identify who is doing this with some ill intent and who is doing this because they're enjoying this time. This is a complicated issue that I think that we need to take on with a greater sense of urgency around what is acceptable and what is not, and it is a huge safety and security issue in terms of surveillance of crew, and leading to further security threats, in terms of escalating situations on the plane when there's already a conflict going on. And so I think this is an area where we could actually use some help from the regulators to have very clear and sensible instruction about what is appropriate and what is not. And we appreciate your backing when we are bringing those issues to your attention in the flight deck. So I could go on and on. I want to leave some time for some discussion here. But this is the most disruptive issue that we deal with in aviation today. The focus on it is important, and flight attendants do not have the staffing to be able to properly address these issues. And so we want to push forward on those staffing issues, on clear issues around carry-on baggage, on clear issues around alcohol, on clear issues around sexual harassment, and on clear issues around photography in the cabin.
Thank you, Sara.
Hi, Steve Moates. I manage the Part 121 Air Carrier Operations Branch within the Air Transportation Division of the Office of Safety Standards. Boy, if there was ever a problem that needed a team approach, this seems to be it. You know, it's part of security, but it's separate as well because it deals with social behavior. And it's very difficult to come up with norms for social behavior because we're all different. Regarding the team approach, I think the FAA, we're on the front end and we're on potentially the back end. The front end, we've got public law, we've got regulations in 91, 121, 125, Part 135 regarding passenger behavior disruption and crew interference. We've got SMS processes at the air carriers, which perhaps your PERC program was generated from an SMS process, just a guess. But it seems a natural flow from it. With the SMS process, air carriers need to get in and resolve their own issues. And it's not a simple issue. Because it's a team approach, it also invites a great deal of finger pointing. And we have to stay out of finger pointing. The one thing we all agree on is we don't want the people on the airplane. The one thing we also agree on is once they get on the airplane and are disruptive, we want the ability to take action. And the ability to take action depends upon a great deal upon the crew's willingness to commit the energy to give us the information we need to take action. I'm going to echo what Mark brought up earlier. Thus far this year, we've only seen 44, our enforcement team has only seen 44 cases where enforcement was a potential. Last year, I think it was 89, and I think you referenced 105 a few years ago. If there are, in fact, 10,000 occurrences out there, there's a lot of holes in the dike. And our lawyers assure me they are more than willing to aggressively pursue any action or any opportunity they get. So I don't know that I've got anything further. We can open it up to questions, down to you. But we're here. As far as we're also committed to continue working to find resolution to the problem. If there's gaps, we need to identify the gaps and become involved. But I believe we have plenty of regulatory authority, and that pursuing regulatory authority or further regulation will take a great deal of time if it gets on the docket at all, and time that might be better spent searching for other solutions.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. That was some tremendous insight that I think is extremely valuable. And with some time remaining, we'd like to open up some questions. If anyone from the floor has some, happy to answer them at this time. And microphone right behind you there. If
yeah, Mark Lineski, United Airlines, and this is for Alexy. One of the questions or answers I heard you say was that you include the employee groups in the reviews. Does that go to the regional partners too? Are the pilots for the regional partners being represented in their flight attendants in these review processes?
Not currently on the actual committee that meets every week, but we do meet monthly with our ALPA and AFA representatives and share that information freely of what happens. Obviously, there's privacy issues with sharing some of the information, but we're pretty free-flowing with the cases, and so that full support can be provided to the employee. We have recently revisited potentially having some members on the committee, because with the expansion, I think the more valuable heads in the room will be important for making those decisions. Lately, it's been a lot of banning of people, so I think that the unanimous decision has been quite easy lately. So the more people we can get in the room to make that decision happen more quickly would be great, in my opinion.
All right, thank you.
Hey, Darren Dorn, Alaska Airlines. So we've identified a lot of issues. Airport, airline crew member identifies the individual. Chief Everson, your people get to deal with it. The TSA and FAA can mandate this, but until we get our prosecutors to actually take the cases, put the time, effort, and energy into prosecuting these people, and some way to track these people. Alexy, you just hit on, we ban them from United, just shift them to Alaska. Right? There's got to be a federally mandated database for disruptive passengers. And that's got to be mandated. Because of the liability issues, the airlines are never going to pass the information from Alaska to United to Delta. It's just not going to happen. There's too much liability there. But there has to be a way to track the bad apples, no different than how we do sexual predators. And on that topic, a way to track all the state databases on sexual predators. The airlines ought to know who they are, so they're not sitting next to our unaccompanied minors. So again, I don't know who puts the pressure on the DOJ or the local city, county, state prosecutors, but you can't say, well, I'd rather publish or go after this high-profile case and not the guy that ripped the tray table off.
thank you for that comment. And next question, please.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks everybody for being here. This question is for Mr. Moates from the FAA and my comments. I think you bring up some good points about, we want to have regulatory process, over this, and I think the regulations do give us that in the captain's authority piece, right? So why is it that we always seem to be fighting with our managements over, captain's authority when it exists, when it doesn't exist, and it just doesn't seem to be equal throughout all the airlines, and we believe one thing maybe from a union perspective of what captain's authority is, and that just doesn't seem to be level across all the carriers, and maybe the FAA thinks something different about captain's authority, but I think this particular piece plays into captain's authority, and that it'll play an important part in solving some of these issues if we can establish exactly what that means. throughout the entire operation. Your comments, sir.
I'll reflect what I talked about in a meeting on Tuesday. Is captain's authority, in my opinion, is sacred, and from that, your relationship with the company is something that we're not in the middle of. So it's one of those, which is going to come first. So it's constant work, and it's almost has to be not almost. It has to come down to specific instances to address specific instances of what actually occurred. If you're talking broad-based, then you've got the proper forum here to deal with your operators. I don't want to give you a bureaucratic answer. I really want to give you a straight answer, but it's a relationship you've got with your company that needs to be reinforced.
Well, I appreciate that, and I just see that as one of the basis of solving some of these issues, really, and and the training to go along with that, and maybe some help identifying what that actually means across carriers. But thank you for your work on that.
Yeah, it's one of the bases. I think that's one of the things I was trying to get across. Is there's no magic wand, no silver bullet. One thing is going to solve this. It's going to be continuous cooperation and work.
Thank you.
And we're there to work.
I'm not sure who was next.
My question goes right along with his. For 27 of the 36 years that I flew for the airlines, in the operations manual there was a sentence that I relied on heavily, and it went something like, oh, by the way, it's not in the flight ops manuals anymore. When a captain is made aware that a passenger appears intoxicated, she will deny board or deplane that passenger. It was really, really simple. And again, there's no single fix, but for my career, that was a policy that I followed directly. It was a direct policy. It said, this is what you will do. You'll deny board or deplane that passenger. And it's not in the flight manual anymore. Go find it in yours. So my point is that it wasn't that I didn't have intoxicated passengers. It was when the flight attendant came to me, I said, if you tell me that person appears intoxicated, they're off. The flight attendants felt great support from that policy, from that approach. And I think that if we started with the basics, yeah, we can do all this great stuff from Washington down, but if we started with the basic crew, supported the flight attendants in that effort, and intoxication is not the only factor, but that was the focus back years ago of that one sentence, that all I had to do is go, boom, it's in the flight ops manual. If they appear intoxicated, they're off. And the flight attendants then had to make a decision. Is this person, do they appear intoxicated? And that was the only measure that they needed. And yeah, we kicked a few people off, but it was straightforward, simple, and it was addresses this issue of captain's authority quite clearly. And I would suggest that you start with the basics, that you consider a procedural approach to this, where you do define what the captain's authority is explicitly, like this did for me, and made my job easier, because it was cut and dry. So could you address that?
Was that for me? Does that need to be in the manual? Captain's authority is captain's authority. When, with authority comes responsibility. And if the captain has, I think the regulations give the captain sufficient authority. From that point, it's a responsibility of the decision, whether it's in the manual or not. I think it's pretty clearly in the regs that the captain's charged with the safe operation of the airplane.
Thank you for that. It sounds like it gets back to the underlying issue that we're discussing here, which is better communication between all the stakeholders. It sounds like we have that codified. Perhaps we just need to have a little bit of a refresher in the discussion to reaffirm what that means in these circumstances.
I think those are generic answers that I'm going to press you on. Each pilot will find a different evaluation for each situation that otherwise should be fairly clearly defined. And having it in the manual the way that I stated, quite frankly, for those pilots that didn't know what was in the manual, they would negotiate the issue with the flight attendant. And yeah, I think you can generically answer these things, but also specific procedures enable an adjudication on the spot of appropriate behavior. So no, I don't think you can just say, hey, captain's ultimately responsible. I think in some situations you need to better define it so that it isn't debated in the situation, that it's well understood. And I would wonder if, Sarah, what you think about such a policy.
Well, I mean, I would agree. It's
Yep.
just very helpful when it's in black and white and it's very clear and everyone knows what the policy is. Everyone can point to it right there and there's no discussion about it. Oftentimes we're under a time crunch and sometimes there is an effort at the gate to try to get people on the plane because frankly it gets them out of their hair. So there can be competing interests in what can look like a subjective situation. And the fact of the matter is that if they appear intoxicated, they don't belong on the flight. There's going to be another one in a couple hours.
The bottom line is it's an excellent point. It's something that needs to be discussed and probably clarified. Absolutely. And I know we have some other questions we want to get to. Sir.
Hi, good morning. Rip Torn with Delta Airlines. One of the technology pieces no one's discussed yet is putting some cameras and video recording in the cabin. One of the issues we talked about when we have a disruptive passenger is the difficulty in getting the evidence. You know, you can put 6, 7, 8 cameras in the back that cost very little nowadays, and you can put them every 10 feet in the overhead. And one of the effects of not only having it as evidence for prosecution is it's a great deterrent. Because when people know they're being, watched and recorded, they're going to moderate their behavior unless they are already off the deep end. So is this something that's been discussed?
I'm guessing, Alexy, that probably goes to you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Interesting question and proposal. Definitely has been discussed. However, there are some roadblocks for that, mainly from our legal division.
Do you want me to do this?
Pardon me?
Do you want me to help you?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay, so there are some issues with having those cameras in the cabin. I will tell you that it just right off the bat sometimes creates an atmosphere that is not as relaxed and not as easily able to resolve issues and de-escalate issues. There's also issues with when there is an event in the cabin. I just jumped in because maybe it's a little easier for me to talk about this. The video angle doesn't always show the actual event. And when there's an incident and there's discovery, people can grab that video and use it to tell a very different story or part of a story that doesn't tell really what happened on that flight. And so while it may serve as a bit of a deterrent on the front end, the liabilities with it on the back end and the ability to use it in a way that would be detrimental to the employees, the rest of the passengers, even the airline, may not rise to the level of saying that it's a good idea to have those video cameras on the plane. Our position has been that it generally is not for all of those reasons. And although your point is taken well, that people are out there with their phones and trying to use that as evidence against us, why not turn the tables on that? When you think about the police monitors and how people view those videos or portions of those videos and how they have an idea about what happened in that event without being there, just start to take some of that in. And what I would say is that from our view at this point, it would be more negatives than positives in the cabin with those video cameras.
Well, again, with the technology and what's available out there, that's just a number of cameras you can put in, and the cost is minimal, and I think the certification issues would be minimal as well, so I respectfully disagree with that. So,
I'd just like to add from an enforcement standpoint, a good presentation and crew reports are more than sufficient to aggressively pursue enforcement. So.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Good morning. I'm Jim Johnson, a staff lawyer here at ALPA. And I learned at this meeting of a program LAX has, and maybe it goes to Chief Everson and Mr. Bidwell, where they are, if it's not a felony, it's most likely not going to be prosecuted. And most of them are not felonies of these events that happen on the airplane. But LAX are apparently taking a program from the Interior Department, and the police officers doing the investigation after they remove the person, and they write a ticket to them, $500 fine, whatever the number is, and that's treated just like a ticket. If they don't show up and the rest, you do get some prosecution. It's instant enforcement, and it is something that may be a deterrent. And I don't know, Chief, if you or anyone else is aware of that program or you think it has merit.
Yeah, I am not aware of the program they have at LAX that you're describing. I'm not aware of that, but I am aware that it is challenging sometimes to get things that happen in flight prosecuted. So obviously if it happens in flight, we talked a little bit about that. It's a federal jurisdiction, and it's been my experience that the FBI has always been very receptive to taking those cases, conducting that investigation, but it does become challenging sometimes at the prosecution level for things to go through, and I think that is largely dependent upon the severity of what happened. So lower level severity, nobody was hurt, maybe not property damage type of things, it may be less likely for them to take those types of cases. But it's interesting about LA. I'll have to reach out and find out what it is they're doing.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for their insight and participation in today's panel. I think we've had a great discussion, some good information, and hopefully we can continue that as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.